How's it going, everyone? Welcome. Ebulier Gonzalez here. Well, in this course, in this video, we're gonna take a look now at how to work with forms. One of the most pervasive and hated topic for a lot of developers. But to me, is that it is important at least to understand truly how you can work with forms, which is something that we all know. At least we have a basics, or I do have a basics and understanding of how to work with the forms, but also is to describe how you can work with them. And I do think this is, despite that it might sound quite silly, which is something that a lot of the time when you go out into a job interview, so on and so forth, they do want to know how well do you know what you know, do you know the trade-off of the thing that you know. Did you memorize it, or do you know deeply it is trade-off? And also is, can you now describe in a sequence your thought, your thinking process? So this is part of this reason of now recording this series of videos, taking looking at the working with states model, and let's get into this, right? So we look at the so working with forms in React is something that might sound quite cumbersome, because the way how we traditionally work with forms and now the React way of working with form. Why is that? Because at the end of the day, okay, when we do this kind of stuff, so for example, like understanding is this binding, and understanding is the state, understanding that we want to now keep track of a state in our programs, and what are the mechanisms for us to keep track of state using the user state, and what this is doing behind the scenes, which is now allowing us is to define is a variable and a set of functions that anytime that we call this set of functions, we can now update that value. In this updating happens is at the React. And in order to understand now what this things is doing, well, we first look at how we can now create our React components, describing is this as a function, and this particularly functions similar like this. All right, when you transform this particular code from JSX into a JavaScript code, this what it does is to take each one of those particular tags and transform into a React element, aka a function from React called create element, that is going to create now this element as a fragment, or this another one as a form, or this another one as a label with these particular properties, as well as the content, aka its children, and so on and so forth, right? So the way how now we handle errors or handle these user inputs in our events, or the way how we handle these user events traditionally in HTML is two form. Or do we query the elements using document again element by ID, or query elements as once you get that element. All right, now okay, and once we get that element, right, So once do we get that elements, whether it's from the document get element by ID or query selector, then we can now append is a function or pass a function as a reference to a particular event. So because at the end of the day, browsers are like this mini private investigator that track every little thing that you do. This is one way of how we can respond to user input, and the other is via the function execution when we pass that in that HTML tag, right? So whether it's a button on the onClick, but now the React way of doing this is inside of this component that you are going to pass now a functions reference or a handler reference, and is now React when it detects a change, a user input change, now it's going to call that function, and then if you define inside of that function is to update the state via the user state hook, then it's going to now update that asynchronously. So in other words, this entire history of how now the user state or this the user state hook allow us is to update this particular state is that anytime that the user now or anytime that React detect an state and we pass now, anytime that React detect an state change based on a event handler, and inside of that we update the state, so React is going to update those state asynchronously. So aka is going to take all of these different state updates and do that in the next tick. In other words, because now this component is going to get because this GSX component is going to get transformed into a JavaScript function, right, where each one of these elements are indeed a React create element. All right, so once now it execute this function, it will have now a JSON that describes the UI at that particular moment. So initially React was going to now on the initial render is going to append all of these elements into the DOM. So when a state change, so the trigger phase is going to now React detect which component caused that, and then call that component, creating now a new JSON, a new representation of the UI, all right? And it's going to continue to call all of those nested elements until there is no more React elements, aka creating now is a snapshot of all of these different components or React components. So once it has now this new snapshot that contain it, or that describes the new state of all of this state that contains the new state of our application, right? Through a fancy algorithm known as the diffing algorithm, is going to spot the difference that it will make now. It will spot the difference, which React will, with a surgical precision, it will going to update or edit the DOM that needs that change. So when the DOM change, so via the commit phase, so when the DOM update happens, now the browser detects those changes and then paint the pixels that match the UI. So this is the difference between re-rendering and painting or repainting. That is, in the case of computer graphics applications, rendering is that takes this unprocessed raw data and convert it into a ready-to-use output, right? But here, the re-rendering is the reconciliation, or is the reconciliation among different snapshots. That's what the re-rendering means. So it's the reconciliation among different snapshots that notes which change needs to apply to the DOM or to edit into the DOM, right? And not all re-renders, not all re-renders triggers a repaint, because if nothing has changed among snapshots, so it won't edit any DOM elements. Therefore, the browser doesn't need to repaint. So all of this is just to understand is the core features of the use state hook. And I do find that that's very, very important in order to describe what is that. So this is one. And now here we're going to look at one of the most common use cases when working with forms, right? So for example, we get this. So forms and data bindings. So when building web application, we often want to sync a bit of state to a particular form inputs. So for example, a user field should be bound to the value of a user name state variable. So this is commonly known as data binding, and most front-end frameworks offers a way to bind a particular bit of a state to a particular form control. So for example, other frameworks like Angular and Vue, which is something that I'm quite familiar, so yeah, they offer is now this. And here's what typically looks like in React. So this data bindings that happens is at forms, okay? Here we need to describe is our form, followed by the label and the inputs here, right? So if you like to take a few minutes and poke at this, what happens if you change or remove the value or unchanged attributes? Let's dig it into. So if you like to take a few minutes and poke at this, what happens if you change or remove the value of unchanged attributes? So if you change or remove the value or unchanged attribute, so for example, if we remove now the value of the onChange here, okay, and then it re-renders this, so we won't able to actually mutate the state or adding anything here. You may wonder, why is this? Well, because at the end of the day, React is now wrapping this element here. So the value is never being updated in this case, because anytime that you now type here, React will detect those changes. We can actually provide value prop to form field with an onChange handler, and this will render a read-only field. If the field should be mutated, use the default value. Otherwise, set either onChange or read-only. So what happened here is this. If we create now, so if we run this, let's be very precise here. When we run this function, when we transform this GSX into a React element, so each one of them will be now a React element per se, React fragment, a form, a React create element with a form, a label, and the input, okay? And each one of them will have now attributes, and we're gonna append that into the props property, okay? So it'll be the type and the ID and the value that now is this search term. right? And nothing else. So if you try to type here, which you say, hey, why it doesn't actually allow me to type here anything else, right? Even if I don't put any value here, and then I re-render here, but now here I am able to input stuff here. And the thing here is that this is known as the input control. So here you are telling to React to take control over this input via these variables that we define here. So in other words, anytime that we're trying to recreate this, okay, so anytime that we're trying to type here, React, what it's gonna do is to detect that change, but since nothing has changed here, at least in this component, it will not do anything. So this is why now React, particularly here, this is known as control inputs. So React is actually taking control over that input by binding is the value to a particular state. So for example, if you now do things like this, and then you say, hey, this will be now cats, right? And then you try to input, again, React, what it's doing is now taking control over that input via this GSX. So if we transform this, it's like saying, hey, this prop will be whatever value is on the search term. And because this has never changed, no matter how many times we type in, since React is now taking control over this input via this expression, so it won't able to update that proper value. However, when we, for example, if we do something like this, all right, and now we can see that the search term properly has been added to this, and then we try to add things here, right? We now look that, hey, React now allow us is to add elements here, so it's not binding, it's not taking control of the value here of this input. It's just delegating that to the browser, to the default value, to the default behavior. And another thing is that if for some reason, right, we initialize now this to undefined, all right, if we initialize this to undefined here, we might look some warning here and say, hey, a component is changing an uncontrolled input to be controlled, and this is likely caused by the value changing from undefined to a defined value, which should not happen. Decide between using a control or uncontrolled input elements for the lifetime of the component. And here you can take a look at what it's doing. In other words, it's telling you that if you're going to use now, if you want the React take control of an input's value, this must not begin with undefined or null. Should not be null. Consider using an empty string. Despite that empty string is also considered like a falsy value, but in this case, here, well, this is not considered as a true-t value here. This is not considered as a true-t value. So for example, if you want to consider is what a true-t value is, So empty string is now false despite of that, right? But it turns out that anytime that you want to define is a particular state here, so initialize that is whether it's with a value or an initial values here. Okay. Okay. So here now both of these will be now matched to. And here is the sandbox for the end of the video, right? But here what it's doing is this input binding in our forms. Input binding that happens in our forms. So React is taking control over that. It's going to update both of them. Synthetic event. I mentioned in the video above that React uses synthetic event system. The events are a special object created by React, not the standard event used in JavaScript. Why does React does this? Several reasons. It can ensure consistency amongst different browsers implementation. It can include a few helpful extra to improve the developer experience. In early versions, this event system had a slight beneficial impact on performance. You got it. In early version, this event system had a slight beneficial impact on performance. Yep. So in early version, this event system had a slightly beneficial impact on performance, though those changes have since been removed. If you see reference online to event pooling or event persist, you can ignore them since this system was removed in React 17. If you ever need to access the real event object, you can access it like an event as it is, right? If you need to access the native event, the way to do that is by saying, hey, event.native. But again, it creates that because this inconsistency that exists amounts event implementation between browsers. So similar to the this is somewhat similar to the CSS reset, because in the case of CSS we have now browsers implement design. So browsers implement design for their elements in different ways. So this CSS reset act as a baseline, act as a common ground. Okay. Good. Controlled versus uncontrolled inputs. So when we set the value attribute on a form input, exactly, we tell React that it should be control input. For example, like this. When we set the value attribute on a form input, we tell React that it should be control input. And the word control has a specific definition in React. It means that React is managing the input. By contrast, if we don't set the value, the input is uncontrolled input. This means that React doesn't do any management. There is a golden rule here. An input should always either be controlled or uncontrolled. And React doesn't like when we flip an element from one to another, and this can lead to a common foot gun. Let's learn about it so that we can avoid it. Consider this situation, for example, like this. We have now the user here. I do think it's this one. We have now this. If we, for example, are binding the input binding the attribute value on a form input, we tell React to control this input, okay, the input value. But if we don't specify, which is something that I described earlier, but if we don't specify any input, React is say, hey, this must be either a control or uncontrolled input. You can flip from one another. Make your mind. So a component is changing an uncontrolled input to be controller, which is in this. There is also actions in React 19. React 19 introduced a new way of working with form called actions, and here's what it looks like. So you got is this, where again is defining is now a particular hook. Use action state, where here you're going to pass is now a reference, a function async reference of what you wanna do, right? To receive the previous state and the form data, and then, well, now retrieve that data and do whatever you need to do after that, right? So in other words, is say, hey, let me send now data to the server with these parameters. And if there is an error, well, return now the error. If it's not, well, it's going to redirect from the server to this. So I do find that this is quite interesting. Very, very, very interesting. Because this is something that, despite that action solve is a particularly, because you can also do some optimistic updates. So changing the UI before that change has been confirmed by the server. But action won't solve all of the form related problems. Consider the first example in this lesson. The lesson form in that example we're displaying the user search term in real time below the form. With action, we only have access to the form data on submit. If we want to do something with it before submitting the form, we'll need to store it in a state. And so in cases like this, we still want to use a control input. Exactly. With action, we only have access to the form data on submit. Exactly. Because with use action, we only have access to the data on the submit. Exactly. And this is when you need to define is the name, the type name, and the type name here, and so on and so forth. And type submit as well. Followed by an error here. Okay. And then here. On click compatible. So there's a mistake that I have seen React developers makes. This lesson is a cautionary tale here. Let's suppose we're building a search form like this. That's right. Okay. This function is a placeholder, run search term, window.alert search term form is going to pass that function here, and then runs that. And run search. Okay. In this example, run search is the function we want to call when the user click and taps the search button, right? In Model 3, we'll learn how to make network requests, but for now, it is a stop. Here's the question. How should I use this function? A lot of developers instinctively solve for by adding the onClick handler on the submit form. First thing first, we do want is to add now is the form here. We want is to wrap this as it is. And there is a number of problems with this approach. Okay, with the on click, hey, call this. So for example, what if the user tried to search by pressing enter and after typing in the text input? Well, I suppose we could tackle that with one key down an event listener like this. And say onChange and then key down. So we're going down a bad road here. So we are re-implementing stuff that the browser already knows how to do. And this is why we use now the use form here. To solve this problem along with so many others, we will wrap our form control into form tag. Then instead of listening for clicks and keys, we can listen for the form submit events, which is way much more simple. So in other words, we say, hey, let's say to wrap this form, all right. It's gonna wrap this form, and when it's on submit, I do wanna call now is this function. In other words, pass this function as a reference. So now React, because it's going to take control of each one of those elements, because at the end of the day, this is now a React element. When it detects an on submit, it will now call this function reference and therefore execute that, which is the window.alert with this. Hey, hello world. So on click, you see is this. It's an embedding page sandpack bundler versus say this. Search for object.object. Okay. Okay. So so we say hello world. It's a object.object because behind the scenes what's happening is this. You have to pass is the event. You need to pass is the event here and the run search to this event dot value or target dot value, and therefore now it's going to receive is the proper parameter, because otherwise you just return is just receiving is the event object, the synthetic React event. They say hey, and now it say hey, this is undefined. E target dot value. E target dot value. JSON string g5 JSON string g5 this. Ooh, it explode vastly. So if you pass now the e dot target dot value, all right, or the other is that you say, hey, I do want to now check what is this. event. Oh, exactly. You need to also is prevent the default behavior. Event prevent default. Exactly. Okay. No, it's okay. It's okay. It's because I never worked with forms here before. My thinking. So if now I pass this search term, yes, it is. Hey, it's now printing that. But there's a number of problems with this approach. That's why we use the use form here. And prevent default. Because hey, we can say something like this. So I do want is to prevent default, and then now run this. And then I say, hey, prevent the default behavior, and there you got it. With the use form. The form submit event will be called automatically when the user click the button or press enter whenever the input or button is focused. When that event fires, we'll return our search. Instead of trying to recreate a bunch of standard web platform stuff, we should use the platform and let it solve those sort of problems for us. So by using a form submit event, we get to use client-side validations like this. Require true and min length 8. And learn more about validation attributes like require, min, and pattern. Default form behavior. Alright, so there is one little quirk with using onSubmit. We need to prevent the default submission behavior. For example, like this, which is the default behavior. To understand why this is necessary, we need to take a trip back through time to an era with our client-side requests, before fetch, before XML HTTP requests, and even before JSON. So this is now some true legacy stuff here. So if you wanted to make a request to a server, like when fetching search results without XML HTTP requests, before fetch, before XML HTTP requests, and before JSON, if you wanted to make a request to a server, like when fetching search result, you couldn't request only the data. You need to request a whole new HTML file. Essentially, the user will be redirected to a new URL, and the server will then render a template into an HTML document using the data sent with the request. Forms still operate this way by default. So when you submit a form, the browser will try to send the user to the URL specified by the action attribute. Exactly. So by default, forms still operate this way. When you submit a form, the browser will try to send the URL to the URL specified by the action attribute. Exactly. If we omit the action attribute, the browser will use the current URL effectively reloading the page. In the context of modern React application, this isn't usually what we want. We don't want to reload the entire page. We want is to fetch a bit of data and re-render a few components with that data. This produces a faster, smoother user experience. That's why we need to include the event of prevent default. It stops the browser for executing the full page reload. But this is when this is before the fetch, before the XML HTTP request, and before JSON. If you want to request a server, it will now the form will navigate the user to that specific URL and fetch the HTML completely. And other form controls. So in addition to the text input, we have been using so far. The web platform provides a lot of additional form controls. They include Textarea, radio buttons, checkbox, selects, range, color pickers. But each one of these are input from forms. If you ever have to work with this form control outside of React, you have likely been surprised, frustrated by how dissimilar they are from one another. For example, Textarea defines the current value as children rather than using value props. As another example, select tag uses selected prop on one of the options children's to signify the selected value. Deselected here. And here's the good news. React has tweaked many of these form controls so that they all behave much more similar. And there is a lot of less chaos with form controls in React. Essentially, all form controls follow the same pattern. The current value is locked using either value for most input or check for checkbox and radio buttons. This is so this is why React create this control input control, because now they create this standard way of how can you access to that. Okay, exactly how you can have access to that, retrieve the value, and have a unified event interface to respond to. Here's the good news. React has tweaked many of this exactly. So the current value is logged using either value for most input or check for checkbox and radio buttons. We respond to change with the onChange event listener. So in this lesson, we're going to go over a couple of common examples, and you will also find bonus cheat sheet at the end of this model that provides a quick reference for all forms control. Bonus input cheat sheet for all of this, whether it's a text input. The select tag. The select tag allows the user to select a single option from a list of predefined options. When working with select tags in React, they work pretty much exactly like text input. We use value and onChange. And here's an example. So we define is the collections, or in this case the selected option here, and the value and the onChange. And the value and the onChange, which is selected options. So here With React, we can now have a single interface to work on, especially with selected. You have the value and onChange similar to the input, and define all of the options value here. So dynamically render this options value here. So by setting the value props, we make this control component. Exactly. So anytime that you set this value, you are telling to React to take control of this input. In this case, deselect. Binding the selected options to our React state when we add the onChange event listener to update that. Honestly, this feels like a huge improvement to me compared to the default functionality of this form control. We don't have to fuss with adding the selected attribute to one of the option children. Instead, we use the same pattern we know and love. In radio buttons. Alright, so radio buttons are a bit trickier here. Ostensibly, they serve the same purpose as select tag, and they allow the user to select one choice from a group of options. The tricky thing, though, is that still this state is split across multiple independent HTML elements, and there is only one select tag, but there is a multiple input type radio. And let's start by looking at an example in the control radio button group. So for example, like this. So if I want to control this input, okay, and since input radio buttons is this, I can bind that value, okay, to one of these options here. Exactly. Hey, if the value is yes, okay, this is now check. And if the value is not, is this one. And add the onChange here. Phew, that's a lot of property. Let's look at each one in turn. So the name. So the browser needs to know that each button is part of the same group. So if you don't, so the browser needs to know that each button is part of the same group, so that ticking one option will untick the other. This is done through the name props. Each radio button is a group. Each radio button in a group should share the same name. The other is the value. Each radio button has its own value. This property will be copied over to our React state when the option is ticked. Each radio button has its own value. This property will be copied over to our React state when we React state exact when the option is ticked. This is the definition of meaning of each radio button. In the case of radio buttons, the value and the ID, like other form control, this is needed so that the label can be associated with the right input. In this case, is this agree no with the right input, with the right label here. And check, this is the props that binds a given radio button to our React state, making it its control value here. Even though it looks quite different, it does follow the same rough formula. We use an onChange event listener to detect when a given option is ticked, and when that happens, we update the React state. For most other inputs, we bind React states to the value props. And in this case, though we don't have a single value props to bind to, since we have multiple radio buttons, so instead we bind to check, controlling the tick untick status for each button in the group with React state, and the radio buttons or select. Both radio buttons and select tags are used for the same purpose, to allow the users to select a single value from a list of possible options. So which one should we use in any given circumstance? Our radio buttons or select. Both radio buttons and select tags are used for the same purpose, to allow the users to select a given value from a list of possible options. So which one should we use in any given circumstance? Depends. If there is a lot of options, like a list of every country in the world, it makes sense to use select, so that we can take away the choice and not flood the screen with possibilities. If you want the user to read every possible options before deciding, selecting appropriate privacy controls, use radio buttons. People tend to take radio buttons more seriously. If the default option is recommended for most users, select input can help keep the user moving smoothly through the form. If you still beat up seven rules of using radar buttons versus drop down menus. Prototyping UX. Prototyping UX, design, front-end developing, and beyond. Right for us. Yeah, there are certain items. In the UX design world. And the other now the exercise here. Control control counter picker. The big league O's country selecting the sample of e-commerce site. Let's build one. Using the data provided in the country's object, create a select tag with options for every country. Bind this select tag to the provider country state variable here. Okay. And acceptable criteria. Use the country constant to dynamically generate the set of options elements. The set of option elements. In order to map over an object like this, you will need to something like object.keys or object.entry. They should be a blank option selected by default, and it shouldn't default to the first country in the list. Okay. So there should be a blank option selected by default. It shouldn't default to the first country in the list. The indicator at the bottom should update when the user changes the selected country. So no warning in the dev console. So in order to select all of our countries here and transform that into a um, a collection, that do we want to iterate over, where I want to show that as options with the ID and the key followed by the label, ID and label, which is part of the country names. Okay. Of the entries, which is gonna give you is a key and the label. Yeah, but this is not actually mapping that properly, because let me actually exactly. So first thing first, we need to render all of these elements here. So in order to do that, what we can do is to say, hey, give me is all of the names here. So what I want to do is to, the input is this, and the expected output is to show this list of elements with an empty options as default, right? Okay, okay, okay. So what we can do here is this. So what I can do here is this. Is define is the countries, or I can define this outside of this and say, hey, counts as the list of country. So countries list, or just simple countries. Okay, and say this is count object dot entries. All right. So transform this object into a collections countries. So transform this object into a collections. Okay, a collections of objects that I do want to render here. So these collections of objects that I do want to render here as countries dot map, where here I'm gonna have is the ID and the label, right? Followed by, and render is this element. Render is the option. And this element option that I want to render here initially will have is the label, all right, where the ID will be is, in this case, the ID, and the value will be now is the ID, right? This is the option and this is the value as it is. Okay, so now since we are initially showing something like this, we do want is that the initial value will be now is empty. So we can say is something like this. So is the country. All right. But I do want it to show now the first element as empty. Okay. I do want to show is an empty element here. So what we can do is, hey, let's going to add now this option empty here, which is now an empty value. Or you can say is no selection. All right. Or selected country. Selected countries. Or select country as it is, right? And this is what I want to show by default. Select country, right? So far so good. So controversial countries. The world is a big and complex place, and not everyone agree on whether certain regions are countries or not. These sort of geopolitical considerations are way above my head. And so I have outsourced this calculation and relying on ISO countries code to make the determination for me. Okay, so it takes that data from this. Wallis and Futuna. Western Sahara. Holy moly. Anyway. But we actually now render is this. Now, if we want to select, okay, now on the input we say, hey, on change, we can say, hey, please, I do want is to now is whatever value that you get here, at that moment, set or call the country with that target dot value. But another fancy way to say is this. You say, hey, give me is the target that it also have now the value itself. And then by the structuring here, you can now pass is the proper value. So when we select that, we already get is that selected country as it is. Oh, selected country here. Digi is the label. Is the label. Selected country now is this one. So this is how you can now, by already having a collection of all of these elements, and using now select as control input to say, hey React, I want you to now is bind this value to a particular state and define these collections of elements here as options, and a default value called selected country. Okay, and you can take this is selected country. All right, we can also say, hey, the value of this will be now empty, right? So selected country now is as it is. All right, you may say, hey, but the initial time is selected country. No, selected country is now empty. This is how you can assign this as it is, and pretty much this is it.
So our goal is to create a country selector, something that has been built by so many developers because every e-commerce platform needs one of these. And we have a good chunk of the scaffolding required. We have our state variable, we have our select tag, we have our countries data, but we don't have the most important part, which is the options themselves. And while we could spend a couple of hours typing them all out one by one, there is of course a more effective way to do this. But it's not immediately obvious how to do it, because the iteration we've talked about in this course so far assumes that we have an array, something like options, where we can call .map and go through them like this. But the data that we've been given is in object form, and even more specifically, it's in like a dictionary type form. It does give us a number of methods we can use to work with this. Maybe you're familiar.
For real? No. No problem. Really? Okay.
Arrays. Essentially, each of these arrays is going to hold two items. The first item is going to be the ID, the key of the object, and the second item is going to be the value. And I do want to grab both of these bits of information because they both serve different purposes. The IDs, the keys over here, are the unique identifier for each country. It's the most pure representation of the user's country, so this is what we're going to use in our React state. It's what we would probably use if this was a real form and we were submitting the data to our server. This is what the real form of the data is. This is really more of a label. It's something that we want to show the user for human friendliness. And of course, we do want to do that, right? We want to put the name of the country in this box, so we need both of those bits of information. I'm going to grab the country names that we've created, and now that we have an array, we can use the trick that we know and love. So I'm going to call .map, which receives, we could call it entry as the name since we got it from object.entries. But actually, let's be a little bit fancy. Let's destructure it so that it receives the array inside has exactly two. And so I can So on the select, I'm going to start by adding an onChange handler. This to finish the data binding and to add the value property. And the reason for that, let me get rid of it for now. The reason for that is, what if we want to set an initial value? So let's suppose that maybe I can already tell that the user's in Canada. Maybe I have that information about them already. And ideally, when the page loads, it should already have selected that option. But because we haven't set a value, because we're only listening for change events, we have no way of actually updating this select with the value in React state. I'll give you another example. And granted, we haven't looked at data fetching yet. We will in the next module. But suppose, and I'll do this in pseudocode for now, we make a request using fetch to a geolocation API to get the user's IP address. And then, a second later, it comes back and it gives us their country code. So then we would call set country with something like response.countrycode. This is a very common thing. There's one way now. It goes from the select to the state, but it'll never go from the state populated to Canada, because that is the value I have used as the initial value in my React state. Okay, so we're almost done. We have a couple more things to do. I do want to talk about what the initial value should be and what it should show, because we don't want to assume everyone's in Canada. I'm going to set it to an empty string, but I don't want it to pick the first country in this list. I don't want m dash to be our initial value. One nice little trick, if I set the value of this to an empty string, and I set the select to be required, an empty string value is not considered valid. So when I try to submit the form, I get some nice HTML validation. So it's not just that we're kind of hacking around this by having a fake country as the first option. It actually is treated as an invalid option. It does look a little funny that it's listed alongside all the other countries. So one nice little UX thing we can do is we can use an opt group, an option group. So it's an HTML element, opt group. It supports a label property, and I'm going to call it countries. And I'm going to wrap all the real countries in this tag. When I do that, check it out. We have this nice little grayed out indicator that kind of shows that all of these values are part of the same group, whereas the first value up here is not. The last little thing, just as like a little quality of life thing, I don't want to show the raw country code. I want to show the name of the country. So instead of just rendering country down here, I'm going to use this country code to look it up in the countries object. So now when I select a new country, we see the full name here. That's one of the benefits of having these dictionary-like objects is once you have the country code, it's very easy to get the full value. And with that, I am fully happy with this solution.
Selected country. And he uses now this is the op group to do this. To say, hey, it's nice to show these nice little things here. And by adding now a value to this, you say, hey, this is now countries. Or a label is this. And there is a two-factor authentication has quickly become a best practice in terms of security logins. For highly sensitive account, the most common form I have seen is that the user is prompted to enter a short code generated from an app. So in this exercise, we build this form. The input validate should be held in React state. And showing the correct code. So we also add a little bit of CSS here by styling this input as it is. Okay. By styling that input as it is. When the user submit the code, a window alert should let them know whether it's the correct or not by comparing their submit value with the correct code constant. And a form tag should be used. So in order to do this, because we want to define is this, the point of doing this is to describe this form that will contain is now this, the label, the input, and the button, using a form to wrap that, adding a particular style to this. So anytime you press that, you can now add this with letter spacing next to each other. Okay, enter authorization code, which is quite silly, but yet powerful. In order to understand now this, so here, by using is the use state from React, you say React dot use state here, and assign this now as a string, and get this as the code, and set code. All right, code and set code. So here we are binding is the value, is the input to React with code, and when on change, I want to is now update that properly with the value that we are getting from the event, which is a target dot value, right? And once we do have this, or we can say something like this. You say target. That will be now called this another function, and say to be a little bit less descriptive, say hey, this is now the target. All right, and I do wanted to call this function here, and pass now this value. Say either target or not. We can even get a little bit fancy here and say target and value. All right, and then now pass that value to the function here. To onChange functions here, right? If we do this, we have to handle is now is the on tap or on click, but because we don't want to do and do this, we just only want is to bind that value there. So now it actually correct update that. What we can do here is, well, don't add this control to this, and in fact, let me now add a form control, where this time I want us to do something like this. I want us to do something like this. So when submit this value, all right, I do want to know is what is the value that I'm getting here. And this value that I'm getting here, okay, and this value that I'm getting here with the event, all right, I want to do a couple stuff here. First is to have access to this form, okay, which is the event dot prevent default, right? And then now have access to the form in itself by saying, hey, Let me actually print that out here. This. So if I do this, and then I hit this, so I do have now this particular synthetic event from that. Where if we dig a little bit here, stop propagation and the target and the bubbles, prevent default, and it is persist. So all what I want to do here is to now have access to that particular date.
So I have to admit, I am really not a fan of two-factor authentication. Now don't get me wrong, I do it for all of my applications, and what it means is that several times a day I have to open my phone and look up the code, and I am just getting really sick of it. I feel like at some point in the future we're going to look back and wonder why we did things this way. Like eventually we'll have biometrics and it'll be a much smoother experience. But until then, we have to use these codes. And so I'm going to start by creating a state hook, and I'm going to initialize it to an empty string, very important, so that this input will always be controlled from the very first render. And I'm going to bind it so that value is equal to this code. And when I change the value, I pass it a function which receives the event, and I call setCode with the event.target.value. With that done, I now need to check when the user enters a code and clicks the validate button whether the number they've entered is equal to the correct code. And I could do that by adding an onClick handler on this button, but that'll only work if they literally click the button rather than, say, focusing the input and hitting the enter key. And really, I want to support both. So I'm going to replace this fragment with a form tag, and I'm going to add an onSubmit listener. I'm going to set it equal to handle submit, which is a function that does not yet exist, but I will create it up above. And essentially, I'm going to say is correct is assigned to whether the code is equal to correct code, right? So this will produce a Boolean value if this value is equal to the value I have in state, and I want that to be true. I'm going to call window.alert, and then I'm going to add a ternary so that if is correct, then the message will be correct. Otherwise, it'll be incorrect. Now, I am missing something here, which is easy to forget, and I'm kind of curious what'll happen if I leave it like this. So let's try it. I'll enter the correct code, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I hit validate, and hey, look at that. I get the correct message. But then my page appears to reload. So it is working, right? Like I'm getting the right values at the right time. But why? Why is the page reloading afterwards? And the answer is that forms have a default behavior that they will make a network request when I submit them, unless I explicitly disable that. And so I'm going to add an event parameter to this function. And the first thing I'm going to do is say event.prevent default. With that done, I can enter my code, click validate, see whether I got the right answer or not, and then continue using the application as you would expect.
But this was yeah, but the question is that how do you make now this targetable on that, you know? So we can do something like this. So alert. And that'll work. Exactly. So if the form, now we're going to look at that button, and on submit, whether it's on enter or clicking here, is gonna now compare that. So because I do want is to control this input and to make sure that I actually control and not switch between one uncontrolled or uncontrolled input. So I do want to get is this code, I mean it's value, and then you say code, right? Where also when this change here as it is, so what I just do one is to pass now this target and the value. I'm doing this in a structured way to the set code function and pass now that value. So when I submit the form here, and then I want is to just to verify, hey, done, right? So I only want to do show is this by saying, hey, if the code that I'm receiving right now match, and I want to do match here and the end, which now match does is a string concatenate a string regular expression. If you don't give any parameter and use match method, return this. You can use this matched for run a regular expression, all right, or you can use this now include to do so. Which is perform a case sensitive search to determine whether the given string may be found within this string. Right? So for example, like this, hey, if this is now is part of this, yes, you might have that. The other is match or match all. All right. So, but in our case, no, the include is not what do we want. In fact, is the triple equal. So we can say is this one and say, hey, is correct. All right. So if this, so I want you to evaluate whatever you have in the code, and if that is the same as the correct code, and if it is correct, so here's gonna do is a coercion, a Boolean coercion. In other words, it's going to evaluate if both of them are the same type. If they are not, they are going to return now false. If they are the same type, which means it's a string here, then it's going to evaluate is each one of those strings in this sequence by comparing to the code units in the Unicode, and if all of those characters at that position match, good, it is correct. So it is true. So therefore, you're gonna now do this. So for example, we say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then we hit enter. We say done. Right. If it's not, then we hit enter. We don't get that. enter authorization code. So that'll be all for this video. Yeah, this might be quite my bending. But let's go to read about this. The Ranger slider should be bound. Okay, this is this. In this exercise, we're building a tool to produce generative art. The tool is nearly complete, but the four controls needs to wire up, and your job is to connect the React states to the control form so that tweaking in the control will update the art. So the range slider should be bound of the number of lines, states. The state control should be bound to the color theme state, and the radio button should be bound to the shape state, as it is. Okay, the ranger slide selector and the radio should be bound to the shape, color, and number of lines. Color theme, and shape. Alright, the radio button label should work correctly. The user should be able to click the text polygon to select that option, and the input should conform to HTML standards. Radio button should be grouped using the name's attributes. Note, all of your change should happen in app.js. The other files are shown in case you're curious on how it works, but you can safely ignore them and focus exclusively on that. So this is this, and the type range that show you this. Okay, followed by the constant, the basic and monochromatic, root loop, spooky, and the utils. That is part of the range. It's a normalize. First normalize the value between 0 and 1. Next transpose that value to our desired scale. Convert polar to Cartesian. And the generative AI art. And the art wrapper. So here, now that we already have all of this, our job is to bind them. So bind this number of lines with the input here, and we say the number of lines here to the input range. So let's go to control this input here by saying a number of line. So the value here will be is num of lines. Okay, and when there is a change, so on change, I want to now update this value. All right, with the target and the value here, and I do want to pass that to the setter function of num of lines. With the value. So now React is controlling this as it is, right? So React now is controlling this as it is. So next one, the other is the color theme, because this input is now a color, and this is now several of this particular color, and this is a select. So we do want is to name that HTML4 numbers line and numbers line. Similar for this, the label HTML4 and color theme, and the color theme, and we do want is to now basic monochrome front loops and spooky night. Exactly, this is now statically generated. All right. But we don't want to do that. So here, since this is a select, we can say is this, and it's going to create now our. This is what the color themes and colors. I'm gonna call this here colors. Define these particular values here. Basic as it is. And the spooky as well. So what I'm doing here is this. Is define this collection of value, right? That I do want is to here in the select says this. Hey, let me now when I do want is to select this element, okay, as an option. I want to render these values, okay, and if I do want to render those values as it is, I can do that in this way, which means is, hey, the basic and the basic, right? We can rename that kind of stuff, or to not get so to prevent don't get too fancy here. Okay, don't get too fancy. It's gonna define our color here and we're gonna define our color here, the color theme. I do want to render this collection of values. Okay. And since this will be the possible value that we can have, so one way to do this is say this. Basic and basic, right? So the key and the value so we're going to iterate through these collections several times, and I tell you why we can do this. Because in this order, so here we are assigning is this key value pair, right? that anytime we need to iterate through these collections, as it is, so that anytime we need to iterate through these collections, all right, we can now safely say, hey, this option value that I do want to show, I want to now is map these collections, and for each one of those elements, the ID and the label will be is this. Will be now an option where I want to render this label here, and this will be now the value here. So the ID will be the value here. So this is just to render this, right? In this particular way. So far, so good. No problem. But when I do want is to let React to control this input, okay? Say, hey, please React, let's go to control now this input here. Let's get into this, shall we? And that is, let's go to now on this select, okay? So the value that I want to bind is the state here, the color theme, okay? The color theme. But when it changed, instead of us to go through selecting that particular option like a normal HTML, we have to, hey, if this is now selected, hey, cherry was gonna get this value. So React now create this wrapper that help us here to work with input in this, using this pattern here. The value and the onChange, the data binding pattern. So this is now the, in here we can say, hey, I do want is to get is the target and the value here, okay? Where once I get that value, okay? So once I get that value, I do want to call now is a set theme color to set the value here. So if I say monochromat, set theme color value here, set color theme, my bad, set color theme, and say monochromat, so it actually now trigger that and update with the proper state. The question is that how it is happening here. That's quite magical here to me. The generative art, because it's selecting one and the another index and the color polygon to compute that. Oh, and then you got is the generative app, where it's going to change now the number of line and the color theme and the shape. So when the generated art change, for example, is when it's triggered is the generated art, when the color thing, when one of this property change, okay, now it say, hey, let me go pick the color by theme. Color by theme must be a constant that contains all of this. Hey, this will be the background, this will be a monochromat, or Fruit Loops, or Spooky. Or Spooky. You know? and then the circles or polygons. Mm-hmm. And then the circles or polygons, especially here, with control headings here. To say, hey, now that I define is the label for the number of lines, the control input for the select, and now the control input for the radio buttons, like this. We might say, hey, the name, it'll be the same for all of us. We can call this as the radio, the shape radio, or the shapes radios. All right, to tell the browser, hey, they belongs to the same group. So now the browser say, okay, yeah, they belong to the same group. Interesting, because if you don't, the browser now going to treat them as uniquely. But here you're saying, hey, no, they belong to the same group, browser. Okay, they belong to the same group. And when the value, or particularly I want to bind is the value to the shape, which is a circle or the other, or the polygon, and the selected will be if the value is equal to the circles, for example. If the shape is equal to the circles, I do want is to get that. And the value is shape. Exactly. So the value is shapes, circles. Okay, so if the value is circles, okay, good, pick that. Circles. So the value is circles, and if the selected is equal to the shape, and there you got it. But when on change, so I do want is to now do quite the same as we have done so far. Target and the value, and then now assign that to the set shape value. And this will be pretty much the same, but for this. But in this case we say polygon. Hey, if this value is polygons and the shade now is polygons, so in change I want this to now set the shape of that. Exactly, so initially set to polygon. And spooky.
So one of my favorite things in the whole world is creating tools that allow users to create generative art. And the one we're looking at here is called TinkerSynth. It's a tool I made a few years ago that allows people to kind of tinker with these controls and create pretty wild-looking generative art. And in this exercise, we're going to build a similar tool where we have our visual output over here and some controls which ideally should change the output that we see. Now, it's not going to be quite that simple because there's some funky stuff going on here, especially with these radio buttons. More on that in a little bit. But I think we should start with this slider over here. And we do have a bit of React state that already exists that allows us to control that, and we can even get a quick preview of what it'll do by changing the number directly. Though, of course, that's not really a solution. Like, we want to make sure that non-React developers can enjoy the tool as well. So if we, let's grab the name of this state, and go find where that input is. We see that we have this input type range, and we're going to wire it up pretty much as if it was a text input. That's one of the cool things about sliders in, well, both React, but also just the DOM in general, is that they behave pretty much exactly like a text input or an email input or a password input. So we're going to set the value so that this slider is controlled by React, and we're going to make it so that when we change the value of the slider, we update the React state. So I'll type set num of lines and pass event.target.value. And now we see happily that our slider does the intended job. Next up, the color theme. Well, we have a different bit of React state, right? This color theme over here. We see the set of acceptable values, and once again, we can get a little preview by changing the raw state value. This one's a little bit different because it is a select, right? So here's the HTML input. But fortunately, selects actually aren't that different either. So I'm going to start by setting the value, and I'm going to make it equal to our bit of React state color theme. Then I'm going to add an onChange handler, which again is going to receive a function that takes event and calls setColorTheme and sets it to be event.target.value. And this works because the HTML markup we've been provided has all these options that have the value property. So when this change event happens, we're able to get this value with this value property over here. And sure enough, when I tweak this value, we see that we now have a melange of different color possibilities. But okay, the fun and games are over. Time to deal with these radio buttons. And there's a bunch of stuff wrong with them. Now, the first is just a general accessibility thing. I can't actually select, like, the text here is just text. It doesn't seem to be working as a label, like with these ones, where I can click on the label and then use the control. I can't do that here. You also may have noticed that both of them are selected when that shouldn't be, right? The whole point of radio buttons is you can only pick one. So we can fix that only pick one issue by specifying a name on these inputs. In fact, you can see not a lot of work has been done, right? We only have input type radio. So let's start by adding a name, and the whole group is going to be called shape. we're going to make sure to use the same name on both radio buttons. That's what makes them part of the same group. And that solves maybe one of the bigger issues, but it would still be nice if I could select these options by clicking on the text. And for that, we have to update this label so that it has an HTML.
Exactly. So because, exactly, it's not a great user experience, so for that I need to update is the label to say HTML form with the same name, shape radius. That, hey, they belongs to that. HTML form name, and the same for this video, say HTML form, or no, this is to group this. If I say HTML form, so if I do want is to select that, it is by ID. So hey, let's go to associate this ID to that. That's interesting. Doesn't work as expected. Okay. Perhaps it's the name. Yeah, but I do want to select that.
4 property, which should point to the ID of this radio button.
But it's because the HTML4 points to the ID of the radio button. So because this doesn't have any ID, we need to provide this. So in our case, we're gonna say is shape radio, or you can say is the polygon radio, which is great. And the other is on the label, you say, hey, this is now circle radius. Exactly, circle radius. Circle radius. Exactly, circle radius. When we do click here, and we need to add this ID to this. This is it, circle radius. So now it's going to properly select that. But look at this. It says yes, good, but the names are the same. Therefore, I'm confused. Therefore, I'm confused. I can say polygon. Match to the polygon. Radio singular. You can say, hey, radio singular. Polygon radio. And the other is the circle radio. And the circle radio. But name here is this. So the name now doesn't belong. The names now belong is to the shapes radius. And now it actually properly select that as it is.
So let's give it an ID of maybe shape-circle, and we'll use that same string for the HTML4. I'll do the exact same thing down here, so I'll give it an ID, but of course, this time, instead of shape-circle, it should be shape-polygon, and we'll set the HTML4 on the label to this value. So now I can click on the text, and that just makes it way nicer to be able to select these options. But now, how do I make it so that when I click the polygons option, our output up here gets, actual polygons? Well, it's a bit trickier with radio buttons and checkboxes, because there's a fundamental difference between these two types of inputs, right? With the select that we've been seeing and the slider, we have a single root DOM node, right? The select or the input, and those are the inputs, those are the DOM nodes that get the value property and the onChange handler. So while it might be tempting to kind of go the same route, maybe add value and set it equal to shape, well, it doesn't work the same way because I have these two different inputs. Instead, what I have to do is I have to set value to be equal to the value of this option, right? So if the first radio button is meant to enable circles in the React state, well, then the value should be set to circles. If the value of this second one should be polygons, well, we have to do the same thing, set it to be polygons, right? Those are the two values that I've gotten from the accepted values up here in the comment. But that's only part of the equation, right? That means that when I select this option, when I click on this thing, we are selecting this particular value, but React doesn't know about that yet. We haven't wired up React. To do that, we have to add the checked property. And essentially what this property does is it's kind of like value on other inputs. It's controlling, right, like the value up here. It's controlling what React should force the value to be. And so we're essentially saying that this input should be checked if a certain condition is true. And that condition is if the shape bit of state is equal to circles, right? If the currently selected shape is equal to this value, then this input should be checked. And similarly on the other one, oh, that's a formatting choice. It should be set to polygons. And when I do that, we're so close, but we're missing one more step, which is the ability to change the value, right? When I click on this input, it fires a change event, and that event currently isn't doing anything because we're hard coding the value with the checked prop. So let's add an onChange listener. And fortunately, this part starts to look a little familiar, a little more in line with what we've been doing for the other inputs. We add a change listener and we call setShape. And we're going to pass to that event.target.value, just like we did with our slider and our select. If I apply that to both of these, we now have a completed generative art generator, and I am pretty satisfied with how this is working. The reason this works, right, the reason event.target.value populates to the right value is because event.target refers to this input, and we've given it a value of circles. So it effectively, what it does is it writes the word circles in here, which triggers a React render, which now performs this check again. So if shape is equal to circles, this is the box which is now checked, and that's what causes the UI to update. Now there is one more quick thing I want to talk about. We have the event.target.value over here, which works because we're specifying the value attribute, but kind of as we saw, right, that value, this event.target.value resolves to this string. So why not keep the string right here, get rid of the value property? And if we do the same thing down here, right, get the polygon string, get rid of value, paste this in. Some of you may have done it this way and thought it seemed quite a bit simpler, right? We're cutting out the middleman. Why bother setting this value prop that is only used inside this function when we can hard code that value? And indeed, it does work. So I want to make clear that this is a valid solution, but I wouldn't advise going this route. And the reason is that in the HTML specification, it is natural for inputs to have a value prop. They're expected to, right? That's how forms in general work. And even though we don't need this value when we use React, we still want to make sure the form works even without React. It's well beyond the scope of what we're talking about right now, but there is a way for this HTML to run without React. It happens in a server-side rendering context. And so you can imagine the page loads. Maybe it's a login form and not a generative art tool, and the user blazes through this login form before React has even loaded. Well, in that case, you can set the form up to still work, but it has to be valid HTML because we can't use React. And so whenever possible, it's just a good idea to do things the conventional, DOM-friendly way, because you'll sidestep a whole category of possible issues when we get to server-side rendering.
Okay. That'll be all for this video. Take care.